So thank you. Okay, super. So welcome everybody to our June Psychology Grand Rounds. Today, Dr. Alla Prokhovnik-Raphique is going to be, speaking with us, and she's a clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of trauma and addictive disorders in her private practice, which is Nurturing Root Psychology. She holds a voluntary faculty appointment here at Mount Sinai, specifically at the Mount Sinai West and Morningside campuses, and she supervises psychology interns on their rotations at the Addiction Institute, as well as conducts forensic evaluations for individuals seeking asylum through the Mount Sinai Human Rights Clinic. In addition to her work, her clinical work, that is, Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique serves as the Chief Liaison and Management Officer for Ukraine NGO Coordination Network, which is a network of nonprofit organizations providing all forms of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. She's actively involved in advocacy through the Mount Sinai Psychiatry DEI Committee and Psychology Collective at the United Nations. And in March of 2023, very cool, Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique was named one of the 50 Remarkable Women of 2023 who are improving New York by City and State magazine, which is really phenomenal. So today we have the pleasure of hearing her speak to us about something that I think is particularly relevant and important, especially in this day and age, especially for psychologists who are practicing in New York State, New York City. She's going to be talking to us about working with refugees, asylum seekers, and survivors of torture. Alla, the Zoom is all yours.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and for having me here. I'm very excited to kind of share with all of you about some of the work that I've been doing. So as part of the presentation, we will be going over a couple of sample cases. I'll be explaining the definition of an assessment of torture to you guys, as well as discussing who are usually the survivors and what are some of the approaches to care and needs. I'll also be talking about the distinction between the asylum process and refugee status and how psychologists can be involved in helping people through the asylum process and forensic evaluations. So I wanted to start out with a couple of cases. I mean, names and identifying information has been changed, but I think both of these cases kind of capture a little bit about the kind of complex histories people are coming in with when they're seeking help. Mr. Ivanov here, the first one, is a 42-year-old gay man from the Russian Federation who had reported a chronic history of being bullied in school. And after coming out to his parents, he was kicked out of his home and had to stay with a couple of friends, and then some teachers took him in. He experienced multiple instances of life-threatening abuse based on his sexual orientation, particularly after being assaulted outside of a couple of gay clubs that he was in by police, but even people, just regular citizens waiting outside of the clubs. One of the days, his colleague had seen him walking out of the club and reported this to their boss, and he was promptly fired from his job, and there were no anti-discrimination laws. He ended up losing his job with no consequences. At age 25, Mr. Ivanov received a diagnosis of AIDS, and he had weighed 43 kilograms at the time, did not have access to really good medical care, but was ultimately referred for what he was made to believe was psychological care, where the psychologist that he was seeing was essentially focused on conversion therapy and telling him, focusing more on making him feel bad about his sexual orientation, rather than really a very complex history of trauma and depression. He suffered chronic depression and attempted suicide twice. And some other traumatic experiences that he had gone through is he was attacked and beaten by his neighbors after being seen with his boyfriend. He attempted to report this incident to police, but was then harassed by police officers and threatened with arrest for what they called homosexual propaganda, which is something that's considered illegal in the Russian Federation. Subsequently, he fled to the United States, where he feels much safer, but struggles with nightmares multiple times a week and a number of other sequelae of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wanted to share this case to kind of give you a sense of the complexities of trauma and legal history that somebody would have to deal with when they're coming here. The second case that I wanted to talk about is Jose, who's a 16-year-old Salvadoran heterosexual male. His primary language is Spanish, but he speaks a bit of English. He's currently residing with his cousin in New York City and attending a local high school. So at the age of 14, he witnessed a gang assault by MS-13 gang members against a rival gang member. And because he was a witness, he was taken to a nearby forest, severely beaten, and left to die. As a result, he was able to get some help from a neighbor and his mother and was taken to a hospital where he spent weeks recovering from his injuries, some of which have not fully healed to today. And his mother was severely frightened for his safety and decided to send him to live with family members in the States. And he undertook the journey alone, traveling through Mexico into the US. He was then stopped in Texas and detained at an ICE facility where he requested asylum with the help of another person who was detained who explained to him what to do, filed the application, and was released into his cousin's custody and is currently awaiting an immigration hearing. So what we know is approximately 68,000 unaccompanied minors entered the United States in a similar manner. And their cases are particularly complicated because they don't fall into the 5 categories for asylum applicants, which I'll be talking about. So what is torture? The United Nations Convention Against Torture defines torture as any deliberate act of pain and suffering, can be physical or psychological, that's intentionally inflicted on a person, whether it's to obtain an information or a confession or to punish them for some perceived slight. And the goal is intimidation or coercion for any reason based on discrimination. And the key in order for something to be defined as torture is that it has to be extrajudicial. In some countries, there are certain laws that require certain type of punishment. And while we may think of it as cruel and unusual, it would not be considered torture under the UN Convention Against Torture because it's part of a legal process. However, if the government is engaging in some kind of extrajudicial harm to the person, that's when we're thinking about it more in terms of torture. And I think the key is also that the government is unable to, is in fact the ones perpetrating the torture. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about refugees. And again, I will be switching between refugees and asylum seekers and explaining what the difference is. But I wanted to kind of provide a little bit of an infographic about where refugees are mostly coming from in the last 40 years. And although you can kind of see some of the trends changing over the years, but although the statistics haven't been fully updated in the last 3 years because of COVID, majority of refugees worldwide are coming from Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Myanmar, and now Ukraine and Sudan. Now, when we think about who's granted asylum, somewhat different from who's granted refugee status, you could kind of see where the majority of people who do end up having successful asylum claims in the US are coming from. And there are a lot of sociopolitical factors as to what contributes to that. But I think one of the main ones is that people who are coming from countries that we do not have a good relationship with tend to have a higher claim for asylum, mostly because it doesn't look so good if we have really good relationships with countries that have severe human rights violations. So what are some of the factors in which people are given asylum? They have to prove well-founded fear of persecution. And when we talk about the forensic evaluations, I'll talk about the evidence that's needed for that. And some of the factors include race, religion, nationality, political identity, sexual orientation, or membership in a special social group. They have to prove that they cannot safely return to any part of their country of origin, which makes some cases particularly complex, and that they're not able to be resettled in another country. I'm not sure if people have been kind of following the news recently, but that has really become kind of the forefront of what we're hearing, is that people who are traveling through other countries are now very strongly expected to prove why they're not able to seek asylum in the country that they transition through. They cannot have persecuted others, which, while of course is important, we think about special populations like child soldiers or people like Jose who may have had some experience with gang membership or have other minors who have been forced to be part of a gang against their will. their claims become really, really difficult. They cannot have been convicted of any certain crime. And at the end of the day, a lot of the cases are at the discrepancy of the Attorney General's at the discretion. So talking a little bit about the transition process. Prior to their escape, very often people experience fear and violence. This can be in the form of threats to them specifically, to their family members, to their communities, and major disruptions in daily life. There's very often loss of freedom if someone's been arrested by the government or tortured, of course, loss of control, and very often separation or death of our loved ones. So often people are having, like if we think about Jose, having to leave his mother behind and go on his own. Now, the escape process itself is often quite perilous. Some people are able to get a plane ticket and come here directly, but very often people are traveling through multiple countries and report experiencing survivor's guilt. There's very often lack of access to basic needs. Again, fear, violence, traveling through some really difficult places, and having to be in hiding, making sure that they're not caught before they reach their destination, as well as guilt around leaving behind loved ones, as I mentioned. When we think about post-escape, we kind of think like, okay, the person's in safety, they must be doing well, everything's okay. But the truth is it brings its own set of challenges. There's often language barriers that the person is dealing with, as well as cultural differences. Their status has changed. They might have been a lawyer or a doctor in their country, and they're coming in without credentials. There's a lot of discrimination in the US and lack of access to services, as well as significant housing instability. And housing, unfortunately, remains one of the most challenging factors to help someone with. So how do people get to the US? And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the asylum process and being a refugee. So refugee status is given abroad. We decide that a certain group of people is being persecuted in their country. People who can prove that membership in that group, as well as personal persecution, are then evaluated in a usually US embassy or similar type of US office. And if their claim is founded, they're given status and they enter the US with already legal paperwork. They're officially then connected with a US resettlement agency and then provided some social support. That process seems to be a little bit more streamlined. Now, we also have affirmative asylum. Somebody's fleeing persecution, they enter the US on a valid visa, and they say, I really need help. They file an asylum application, and then they have to go through the legal process. Very rarely are they granted asylum right away. Most often, they're then deferred to a judge to prove their case in court, where they can then be either granted asylum, they can be denied, and then deported. There's also people who are coming into the US, fleeing persecution, and request asylum at the border. Then they're often nowadays deported, brought to an immigration detention facility, where they again are either interviewed, assessed for whether or not their case seems credible, and scheduled for a hearing. Usually those hearings are quite far off. As of right now, it's about 7-year wait time. And then we have somebody who's applying for defensive asylum. Person flees persecution. They do not request asylum at the border. They enter, and then they either overstay their visa or they enter in what we consider a legal way. And then they're having to prove their case. So as you can see, there's different ways in which people kind of come into the US, and we often use asylum seeker and refugee interchangeably, but legally speaking, it's a very different case. So I wanted to show you a little bit about the refugee ceiling and how has that been changing over the last couple of decades. As you can see, in the 1980s, when the Refugee Act was first passed, we were accepting quite a few refugees. And very often every year, the president sets a limit for how many refugees we're willing to accept that year. Very rarely do we meet our own ceiling. So the amount of people coming in is often far below. The current administration has pledged to reverse some of the trends that you're seeing from 2016 on, which has been a historical low since the passage of the Refugee Act. And this is a little bit about how we compare to the rest of the world in terms of refugees coming in and resettled. And you can kind of see that around 2001, following 9/11, the trend had changed pretty significantly and hasn't really picked up to what it was before since then. So a little bit about where refugees are commonly resettled within the US. I found myself somewhat surprised that actually Texas is the #1 place where refugees are resettled. New York is not as surprising, but primarily major city centers that have access to different services where people can be connected with community members and supports. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Physicians for Human Rights, which is a wonderful organization that was founded in 1981 by a physician who, after traveling to Chile, noticed essentially maltreatment of other physicians there who were documenting human rights abuses, and found that he was able to intervene in the case and actually have a pretty significant impact on what was happening because he was an MD. So a little bit in their own words, Physicians for Human Rights works to reform policies, practices, and laws that directly violate human rights and undermine human rights protections. And they use the expertise of medical professionals. They seek to end human rights abuses through medical science, forensics, and public health. And very much PHR sees itself as witnesses. We have a choice. We can either stay quiet about the abuses that we're seeing, or we can bear witness and demand that it stop. So how does PHR work? The physicians working for PHR document human rights abuses. They're often experts in investigating extrajudicial killings, so any kind of exhumation of mass graves, evaluation of multiple murders. They conduct physical, medical, and psychological evaluations for asylum within the US. So that's something that I'll also be talking to you about, as well as advocate for justice and empower local communities. Some of their areas of focus is, as I mentioned, asylum applications and persecutions, as well as attacks on healthcare workers. So if healthcare workers are doing their jobs and are being attacked, that's something that they would intervene with. Killings and mass atrocities, sexual violence. And when I say weapons, usually evaluation for things like chemical weapon, use of any illegal weapons on populations. So they would assess and prove that that's what happened. As well as challenging when doctors themselves are committing harm. So engaging in harmful practices such as hymen examinations or unnecessary surgery on intersex children. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Mount Sinai Human Rights Clinic, in which I'm connected with and that do amazing work, where they assist individuals in seeking asylum. They conduct expedited psychological, physical, and gynecological evaluations in order to help people support their claims, and work with Mount Sinai social workers and partner organizations in order to provide social services, as well as engage in research and advocacy work. So if anybody has a chance to volunteer with them, I really strongly recommend that. Some of the communities that are served by the Mount Sinai Human Rights Clinic, you can kind of see where people are coming from. Primarily women, usually struggling with domestic violence or fleeing abuse. And Bellevue NYU Program for Survivors of Torture is another program that I had worked with about 10 years ago and was established in 1995 by medical and mental health professionals, and provide really comprehensive multidisciplinary services to over 4,000 people. And the average length of treatment is about 2 years. And they provide medical care, culturally sensitive mental health care, food, housing, which can be really challenging to find, language skills, employment, education, really importantly, legal services. Lots of family reunification work, which is also particularly important. As I mentioned before, people are often coming without their family members, and helping them reconnect really is quite important. And there's also another program in New York tied to Elmhurst Hospital, which is also affiliated with Sinai, called Libertas, which does somewhat similar work. So what are some of the needs that this population is coming in with? Very often, of course, housing and shelter is a big issue. People are coming in, they may not have community connections or family members here, don't know how to navigate the city. So they're really in need of shelter, food, clothing, as well as legal help. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier is that a person has to apply for asylum within a year of their arrival. If they don't, chances of their case winning or them getting asylum is really, really difficult. And you have to prove why someone was unable to apply within that year. Not knowing the law is not, unfortunately, a good enough excuse for the courts. So getting somebody connected with legal help is really, really important. Now, of course, medical care, psychological support. As I mentioned in the two cases, you could see how complex the traumas that people deal with are very present. Community support, as well as safety. Safety is very important. So what are some of the treatment goals? You want to promote wellness and recovery. This is a very resilient population, but very often it's hard to see that when people have gone through such complex traumas. So you want to be in part collaborating with a person in order to increase their own sense of empowerment. Help build community and connections, as well as increase competence and confidence. So helping people navigate their environment, really helping them be a little bit more independent, as well as build knowledge and increase self-determination. So how do you empower someone who's gone through so many things? You want to be very client-centered and help people rebuild a sense of control. So I very much treat this as a collaborative relationship. Even though I have my expertise in mental health, the person is an expert in their life. So really working together to see how we can meet their needs, as opposed to having my own agenda. You want to have some background knowledge, but also give the client some room to teach you, as well as going with their flow. You don't stick to a script. You try to kind of meet people where they're at, as well as noting the person's strengths. Those often get forgotten. People often notice how their lives have changed, things they're no longer able to control. So you want to keep bringing somebody back to, well, how did they survive? How were they able to make it where they are? And you want to be mindful of language. The person is a survivor, not a victim. Risk assessment, of course, with such complex trauma is really, really important. So during an intake, you want to make sure to ask directly, both during the intake and some individual sessions, as well as keeping an eye on risk factors during group therapy. You want to have a balance of assessing for risk factors, but also protective factors. Very often people will have pretty high risk factors, but there's a lot of things that are keeping them safe too. And then of course, do a safety plan if needed. And if somebody is in imminent risk, walk the patient to psychiatric emergency room, call 911, or provide referrals. The therapy that's often done with this patient population is, of course, very trauma-focused. And some of the therapies that have been found researched to work really well with this population is narrative exposure therapy, as well as trauma-focused CBT. Seeking safety has been very helpful if there's major substance abuse that's present, as well as also teaching people relaxation strategies. So mindfulness, grounding exercises, stress reduction, as well as reduction of psychosomatic concerns, which are very common. Group therapy is also really important. It helps build community connections and extend support networks, as well as helps reduce stigma associated with mental health services. There's a lot of stigma still in the world, so really helping somebody understand that, we don't think that they're crazy. We want them to kind of connect and see that others are struggling with similar symptoms as well. It also helps to have some shared experiences through loss, trauma, and acculturation. And in this kind of group, the support group, the role of the facilitator is to create an environment that is conducive to sharing. It's a little bit more didactic for the groups that are more psychoeducation, less so in a support group. And actually, Bellevue has a couple of groups that they run. The first one is a survivors group, which is a supportive psychotherapy based on somebody's preferred language of choice, sexual orientation, or country of origin. And the goal is to kind of strengthen coping strategies. And they also have an orientation group that is more of short 4 sessions, psychoeducation group that helps increase the patient's knowledge of trauma, medication that they could be using, ways that different providers can be helpful, as well as also helps identify clients that may be in need of a higher level of care. So some innovative treatments that have been currently being researched, of course, art therapy has been found very, very helpful. Yoga therapy. The Marjorie Kovler Center in Chicago has started a whole horticulture project, so helping people kind of engage in gardening and planting while discussing their own challenges. The Right to Life project, so using creative writing techniques as a medium for self-expression as well as processing. And most recently, actually, at a presentation, learned about Dr. Rachel Cohen's Common Threads project, which is incredible and is geared towards survivors of sexual trauma to kind of come together and sew their stories onto cloth in order to discuss things that feel unspeakable. And it integrates some tradition with best practices from trauma-informed therapy, body work, and psychoeducation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about forensic evaluation, which is very different from the treatments that I have so far been discussing with you. And the goal of the forensic evaluation is to help evaluate somebody's claim for asylum and to see the credibility of the claim that they're making. And the way you do that is by obtaining a full psychosocial history. And that's often in addition to what the lawyer already provided. So you want to kind of go through, though you have some background information, you want to go through everything. New facts may come out. A person may have been in a very different psychological state when they were speaking to their lawyer. You want to evaluate the person's present symptoms and establish facts that are related specifically to the trauma history. I think one of the things that are most looked at is consistency. And as we know, trauma narratives are often very inconsistent. So as a mental health professional, as a psychologist, you're able to explain to the courts why somebody may be inconsistent. So you educate the judge as well as immigration officials on the psychological sequelae of trauma and why somebody's story may not be adding up or why it has changed since the first time they presented it to their lawyer. So in preparing for the evaluation, you want to do a thorough review of the client's country of origin and the conditions there, and gather information regarding any conflicts that may be pertinent to the evaluation. You also want to provide education for the courts that substance abuse within the context of trauma, is very often an adaptation and ways people are trying to deal with their traumatic symptoms. Unfortunately, in our country, substance use is still very much viewed as a moral failing. So you want to provide education about ways that it connects with trauma. So it's very important to start the evaluation with a disclaimer, because this, even though you're a psychologist, you're a mental health clinician, you are not in a treatment relationship. So whatever somebody tells you is actually not confidential. It's the opposite of that. You will be gathering all the information they provide you with and presenting it to the courts in a written report. So the goal of the evaluation is not to help the client, but really objectively evaluate their claims. And this can be particularly challenging for clinicians. So it's really important to kind of work on keeping that balance. At the end of the evaluation, we provide an affidavit, which is a documentation of the history of the patient that they had reported. And as I mentioned before, you want to address the degree of consistency between the psychological findings and any reported trauma history. So there are a lot of things that are included in the report, including the clinician's qualifications, licenses, relevant experiences, current work history. But you also want to make sure to get a very, very thorough history from the client. So full psychosocial history, including developmental history, experiences and symptoms prior to the persecution. If they're making a claim that they're experiencing post-traumatic symptoms after being attacked, you want to make sure they weren't experiencing them before or something else hasn't happened. And very detailed experience of persecution, as well as history after the persecution. So as we talked about, what caused them to flee, the transition period, as well as what life has been now. You want to provide a thorough mental status, as well as any diagnostic findings. And you also comment on potential impact if the client were to be deported. So what's going to happen based on your professional opinion if the person was going to be sent back? And you notarize and sign the report. So again, as mentioned before, it's really important to get the person's very detailed history of their transit, especially if they traveled through other countries, because one of the questions that's going to be asked is why didn't they seek asylum in the country that they traveled through? So you also want to address what was happening there. In some cases, you could say, okay, the same gang activity that the person's fleeing in their country of origin is present in the country that they're passing, and it's a huge risk to them to stay there. And you want to make sure to provide that kind of information. You also want to assess their perceptions of the fear of return. What do they think is going to happen if they were sent back? And you write the DSM diagnosis, but also make sure to explain it for non-clinicians. You ask certain questions. So what would happen? What would you do if you had to return? Is there anything you can do to do so safely? And why couldn't you go to a different part of the country? I think that's also a big one. And really getting a sense of why they think that. Have they known somebody who's in a similar situation who has gone back and something bad happened to them? That can really help evaluate the credibility of their claim, but also make a case for why they can't go back. You also can be called to testify as an expert in an asylum case. And in that case, your role is to be an objective witness. You're seeking to explain the client's behavior. You're not there to advocate for them. In fact, if you're trying to advocate for them, that'll harm their case, because then your credibility as a neutral witness is under question. You want to establish expertise. So what are some of your professional experiences and trainings? And this is where you kind of bring your affidavit. And some of the things to cover is consistencies and inconsistencies in behavior. How do they fit with a clinical diagnosis? What could you expect with someone with such a condition? Detailed description of symptoms and any course of treatment. So if you're having somebody in front of you and their depression symptoms have reduced, but you know they've been in treatment for a year, that's a good case that they're probably not malingering, because you're seeing what you would expect with somebody getting treatment. You want to help the judge answer the questions if the client has gone through what they're claiming to have gone through. And what we know is that if somebody's applying for asylum, chances of them getting it are about 30%. But if they have an expert testimony, whether from a medical provider or psychological provider, the cases go up to 95%. So having an expert testify in the case or contribute an affidavit makes a significant difference in somebody's claim. So what do psychologists specifically contribute to the asylum proceedings? As I mentioned before, diagnostic application can support an applicant's claim. You can also talk about the role of culture in somebody's symptoms. Why is their depression manifesting primarily physiologically? Why are there so many psychosomatic symptoms? And how the two relate to perceived deficits and credibilities in somebody's claim. Why are there gaps in somebody's story? When somebody's struggling with trauma, why certain things may look a little bit different. You also can help attorneys improve their ability to elicit the trauma narrative. Very often attorneys come in and say, like, I want to help this person, but I'm not able to get their story. Can you start with them? Can you try to elicit some of the narrative first? And you also want to enhance their resilience in response to vicarious trauma. The attorneys are having a reaction to hearing these kind of stories as well. So you can also kind of help a little bit navigate that, figure out what to do, how to manage. So as mentioned before, safety is very, very important with any population, but especially with this population. They have often experienced a loss of safety and trust in others. And we can kind of think back to Mr. Ivanov, whose one experience with a psychologist was somebody trying to change him rather than help him. So coming in and meeting with another psychologist can feel particularly jarring and scary. So you want to keep in mind of things like that. And you want to create an environment where the client feels safe to open up and share their story. How would you do that? Very often in pre-pandemic days, but maybe even now, if you're doing the evaluation in person. It helps to meet the client at the door, introduce yourself, and if they have to wait, give them an approximate time. You may not know 100% how long it will be, but give them a general sense. As much as you can provide information about how the process will go, the more helpful it is. I often offer a drink of water. I think it's important to have water during the interview. It's a very challenging interview. You try to reduce ambiguity as much as possible, explain consent, limitations thereof. Again, this is not a treatment relationship. And if there's a team involved, if you have somebody shadowing you, you want to explain the role of the team in the process. Normalize anxiety. This is very stressful. Somebody's entire asylum claim could be hanging on this interview, and they're very nervous talking to somebody in an official capacity. So kind of acknowledging that that's common, and give them an approximate duration of meeting. So if the evaluation is in English, usually they're about 2.5 hours long. If there's an interpreter service present, then usually it's about 3 hours long. It's very long meetings. You want to build trust. So again, you anticipate the difficulty of the interview and you acknowledge it from the beginning. And offer as many breaks as possible. Very often people don't feel comfortable asking for a break or aren't sure they can ask for a break. So you really encourage them to verbalize that and say, you know what, maybe I'm the one who needs a break. Let's take a few minutes. You want to be genuinely curious about somebody's story and respond with compassion and not pity. Nobody wants to be pitied. As well as try your best to provide a safe and comfortable location. So you want to be mindful of things like outside noise that can be triggering, use of speaker phones, have tissues available, ask if the interpreter is working for them, check in if there's good rapport between them and the interpreter. There have been cases where the client and the interpreter had some issues and they didn't feel fully comfortable speaking in front of them for whatever reason. You want to know those things as it'll affect the narrative that you're able to get. So where do you start? You try to help minimize distress. And you want to start with the easier questions. This is not the place where you ask what brought you here today. In fact, that would be too challenging. You don't want to launch somebody directly into their trauma narrative. You ask about their current living situation, any recent activities, how they were able to get to the interview, very concrete, basic things, as well as gather a comprehensive history. So their life pre-abuse, their psychosocial history, any medical history, have they had any traumatic brain injuries, things like that. Trauma history, you want to be as detailed as possible: who, what, where, when, why, how. And very often it's important to ask if they had attempted to report what happened to them to police. And sometimes people will think it's a silly story, silly question to ask because police were in fact the perpetrators. But in cases like, for example, with Mr. Ivanov, it actually speaks to their experience of torture because he did try to report to police and police ended up harassing him. That very often provides a different picture about what's happening. You want to know about the escape, the immigration process, any trauma that they may have experienced there, as well as what life has been like post-abuse, any current symptoms that they're experiencing, and of course, their mental status. So some of the potential barriers to both eliciting the trauma narrative and getting kind of a thorough history is inadequate time. Like I mentioned, the interview is about 3 hours long. Sometimes there's more information to be gathered and just not enough time to do so. There can be lack of access. This has gotten particularly challenging during the pandemic, especially at the height of the quarantine when people wouldn't have privacy, may not have access to babysitters, maybe feeling sick. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. The patient could be in pain, fatigued, hungry. It's very hard to talk about some of these things when you haven't eaten in a couple of days. And of course, there are psychological barriers. So any active PTSD symptoms, depression, psychosis, all of those things you want to include in the affidavit as you're speaking to the person's claim. There could be some gender issues. In cases where there's suspected sexual abuse, same gender interviewer and interpreter may be preferable, but maybe they're not. And that's something you also want to keep in mind. There could be, like, male survivors may be a little bit more reluctant to disclose abuse. and interpreter issues. I can share an anecdotal experience of working with an interpreter who had made some inappropriate comments to the client based on the LGBTQ status. And thankfully, the client was able to report that to me so we could switch the interpreter. But very often that happens and they're not feeling comfortable. They're feeling, again, discriminated against by the interpreter, and you may not know. So you want to really check in with a client. And of course, there are cultural taboos on discussing certain topics. So what are some of the common symptoms that we see in diagnosis with this population? Of course, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and substance use disorder can be very common. And as I mentioned before, this is really important to address ways in which the client who's struggling with substance abuse is attempting to deal with their traumatic symptoms. Very often, unfortunately, claims are pretty significantly harmed if somebody has substance abuse. The judges very often see it as a moral failing or decide that they're not the kind of person they want to give asylum to. So really explaining ways that substance use and trauma go hand in hand. Any somatic symptoms a person might have had or any traumatic brain injury that they have experienced. Just a little bit about working with interpreters. What I find helpful is having a brief pre-interview conversation with the interpreter. So just introducing myself, explaining the purpose of the interview, kind of gauging if maybe the interpreter will have issues talking to the client about some of those issues. I've had cases where interpreters reported, I've gone through something very similar and this is very hard for me. So keeping an eye on things like that. You want to create a warm environment. You greet the patient, as I mentioned, if you can, at the door. You introduce the interpreter and explain the role. Now, managing boundaries is really, really important. It helps ensure both accuracy. You want to explain confidentiality. It's really important. And you maintain eye contact with the patient or the client. You don't speak to the phone. You don't speak directly to the interpreter, even though you're speaking the same language. You want to be addressing the client directly. Try to avoid any jargon. It's harder to translate. And have brief and concise statements. I also find it really helpful to debrief with interpreters after the interview. So any cultural elements that you might have missed, any type of words used, it's kind of helpful to know that. Some multicultural issues to keep in mind on. So there's no one way of doing things. You want to be aware of any assumptions you're making, whether similarity or otherness. It's not always best to assign an asylum applicant to a clinician with a similar background. There could be issues with that. And there are multiple reference group identities that can impact how you're being perceived. So you may see yourself in one way, but to the client, you're being perceived in a different ways. So there are, of course, identities of personal salience as well as external salience. And you have the power to label and define. So keeping in mind on that as well. And the ways that we do that is through diagnosis, pathologizing behavior that might have been adaptive. So really keeping that in mind. And some therapist considerations, of course, vicarious trauma. I had a colleague that used to talk about vicarious resilience, which I thought was an excellent concept and really a nice way to kind of look at things, really seeing the strength within you, seeing the strength within your colleagues. Self-care, we talk about it all the time, but it really is important. Working with this population, team building, team's really, really important. Support with people who are working with a similar population, having people to check in with is really helpful. Of course, reliance of coworkers. Thank you. I will stop share and open the room for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So we are entering the question and answer period of our presentation. As a reminder, if you do need the CE link, it's in the chat. And if you have any questions for Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique, please just put them into the QA right now, and she can address them one at a time.
I'm seeing one question here. Are you able to share your slides and do we have access to the recording? I do believe there should be access to the recording. I will defer to Marie about that. I'm happy to share slides. I could put my email in the chat, so if you'd like to follow up with me, I am happy to send you that.
We do hold on to the recording just to answer that question. As we do with all presentations, and you can contact the Grand Rounds team to learn more about that. You do have a question here in the Q&A. It's from Marina Mazer. Alla, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I'm just starting to get trained in doing these types of evaluations. Would you consider sharing your presentation and any advice for someone just starting out?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to share my presentation. I put my email in the chat if anybody would like to get that. Advice for somebody just starting out. I think having, again, support and mentorship is really, really important. I found it incredibly helpful to connect with previous supervisors, and depending where you're going to be doing those evaluations, or I'm guessing through some kind of clinic, there should be people there that you can kind of talk to, really like walk through your thinking, see if you're covering all bases. It really is important to have support when doing this kind of work and not really feeling like it's just you on your own.
Thank you for that. You have another question in the Q&A. This is from Goldie Alfasi. Do you have any suggestions for organizations with which we could volunteer? Thank you for a very helpful presentation.
Sure, absolutely. If you're part of the Mount Sinai network, you can definitely do the training through the Mount Sinai Human Rights Clinic. They're always looking for clinicians to help out, and you could volunteer. There's also a list of different organizations on the Physicians for Human Rights website, and a number of different clinics in the city that do this kind of work. I believe Cornell and Columbia have been doing trainings and do take on volunteers as well.
Okay, thanks for that. There's one question in the chat from Lisa Cohen, your Zoom moderator for today. She is saying you did a great job on your talk, and she's got two questions. One is there any way to obtain collateral information outside of the client's narrative?
That is a great question. It really depends on situation. There have been cases where people come in and their experience was reported in a newspaper locally in their country of origin, and they have clippings. There have been people who have documented certain things or photos that they're coming in with that provides a much stronger case and some collateral. It's a good question. I'm not sure if you can kind of bring in other people, and very rarely is somebody coming with witnesses or someone else who has seen their experience, but certainly wouldn't hurt.
Okay. And her second question is, how do you ask about the client's relationship with the interpreter if you have to communicate through the interpreter?
Great question. It can feel incredibly awkward, but you just kind of go for it. And the interpreter has to translate that. Sometimes I've had people kind of communicate with me non-verbally or explain that they're kind of uncomfortable, or they're able to use a little bit of English to express like something's not working. But yeah, it certainly is a challenge.
Your next question comes from Maria Christina Aguirre. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. Where can we get today's presentation, please? Thanks. And similar to previous question, I'll put your email in the chat for everyone, and you can certainly ask Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique if she would be willing to share her slides.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share my slides. Please email me and I will send them directly to you. And I'm not sure if the recording is going to be somewhere.
It will be somewhere.
Okay.
TBD how to access it. We had been actually posting some recordings to a Mount Sinai YouTube channel for a while, but I think are paused on that due to technical difficulties. So TBD on that. Your next question comes from Molly Scher. How do you address lack of PTSD symptoms in the report with someone who has experienced extensive trauma but doesn't have symptoms?
That is a great question. Of course, not everybody is going to develop PTSD after even significant traumatic experiences, so you want to address that too. PTSD is not guaranteed when somebody goes through trauma. You also want to kind of evaluate if there's some related symptoms that they're having. And there could be a number of things. Whether you're finding that the PTSD symptoms aren't there because during the evaluation, you're just not picking them up. Maybe the measure is an issue. There's a couple of, I've had a couple of cases where somebody's symptoms were discrepant from what I was seeing in the interview from the measure that they were completing in their language. And that can create a lot of problems, but we were able to discover that the measure is actually at a different reading level than they had. So there could be a number of factors that contribute why somebody's not presenting it, but ultimately not everybody develops PTSD.
Thank you for that. And while we're waiting for more questions, and I'm sure people are just formulating their thoughts on this very complicated topic, I'll ask, as I know you've done a lot of work in this area, and I'm not sure if you're still doing it in quite the same way, but maybe just a comment on what the experience has been like for you to work with this population.
Sure. I mean, that has changed over time. I've personally really enjoyed working with this population. It feels like very meaningful work. It helps me learn a lot about different people's experiences. So I actually very much enjoy it. It has been a little bit more challenging now. I haven't done as many asylum evaluations because of my humanitarian work in Ukraine. And that's been a little bit harder because it feels a little too close to home. So also keeping in mind kind of on any personal barriers and, checking in with yourself and not pushing yourself when you can't.
Thank you for answering that. You do have a question from an anonymous attendee. Can you speak to interviewing with children and adolescents and what this looks like? Thank you.
That's a really great question. So because of I'm trained as an adult psychologist, I primarily work with adults. I would not be the best person to work with adolescents in terms of expertise, especially if working with parents, certainly, but I think if somebody's coming in as an adolescent, it's best for them to speak to someone who's an adolescent or child psychologist directly. But as one of the cases I presented, he was a young adult. He was 17 years old. So really kind of keeping that in mind as well, that the way that the conversation will go will be a little bit different. And what kind of icebreakers to use will be a little bit different.
Thank you for that. All right. Still have a couple of minutes if anyone's interested in asking a question in the Q&A. I guess I can ask you, Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique, if they're now having gone through your presentation today, is there anything you feel you might want to say as a takeaway message for those listening to your talk?
As a single takeaway message. Good question. Honestly, if I had to say anything, I would say if you're even a little bit interested in working with this population, go through the training. You can take on as many or as little cases as you want, and it's really meaningful work. And I really do hope more and more clinicians get involved in this kind of work. I see a lot of trainees kind of coming in, applying for internship with more and more of this experience. I'm very excited to kind of see that because it really does make a difference in somebody's case to have an expert.
For that. So there are no questions in the chat currently. We'll just give it another few seconds. So I want to thank you, Dr. Prokhovnik-Raphique, for an amazing talk. And thank you to the participants for attending our psychology grand rounds. We will be pausing, I believe, for the summer. So look out for announcements for future talks starting in the fall. And thanks everyone again for attending, and we'll say goodbye.
Thank you so much.